Welcome to the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. These are the new facilities that we have now. We're very pleased with it. We just moved in and just recently got the art installed. And we have meetings here. We have in the back, we have offices for some of the staff, and our reception will be behind those gates also afterwards. So please stay for the reception. Before we get started, we do need to recognize the terrible tragedy that's happening in the Middle East. There's no way to defend or what happened when Hamas terrorists deliberately went after families and innocent people. But we also recognize as the Kaufman Institute that this isn't a part of the world for which there has been conflict and frankly discrimination and unequal understanding, and we recognize that too. And because we work with all religious communities, we must keep that in balance and seek peace no matter what else we do. We do care and suffer with those innocents, but we also have work to do in the future to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Anyway, we're pleased to have you here with Kaufman Institute. We're also pleased to sponsor this event with the Padnos family. The Padnos families, I should indicate, because Louis Padnos had two sons and they took over the company, Stuart Padnos and Seymour Padnos. By the way, this is Seymour Padnos's 103rd birthday had he been alive, but it was today. It is today. But Grand Valley has been very honored and privileged to have support from both sides of the family, the Stuart and the Seymour Padnos sides. And the Stuart Padnos side has been, he was a student at the University of Michigan and had a warm spot in his heart there. He had to leave to enter the World War II and ended up as a prisoner of war for 5 months, I think it was. Anyway, both Padnoses have been very supportive of Grand Valley in many ways. And the Stuart Padnos family in particular, along with the Padnos Foundation, has been supporting the Frankel Center with a visiting professorship. And we're so pleased that we are doing this event in conjunction with the Frankel Institute. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us. And we hope it helps get the University of Michigan and the Frankel name out there. We like to compete. We probably won't compete in football, even though we've got a great season this year. But anyway, we'd like to cooperate even more. And this is a wonderful example of the cooperation that we do together. So I'm also very pleased to recognize both Doug Padnos and Jeff Padnos, two of the sons of Stuart Padnos who are with us this evening. Thank you for being here and for the support you've given. I see somebody's Interestingly, Jeff then became the third generation president of the Padnos Center, and I'm sorry, the Padnos Company. And then their brother, Daniel, his son, Jonathan, is now the president, the fourth generation of that very successful company in our community, for which all of us in West Michigan, as well as Ann Arbor, have appreciated. So thank you again for the Padnoses. Thank you for Frankel Institute. And now my privilege to introduce to you the director of the Frankel Center, Maya Bresloff.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this introduction and for your really kind and wise words about the situation. Can you all hear me? Yeah, even a little bit further down. So we're so glad you could all join us today in person in Grand Rapids. And I also want to welcome those streaming the event live. My name is Maya Barzilai. I'm the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Rebecca Sharbach Wollenberg, and tonight's lecture, which is entitled Abrahamic Vernaculars, Rivals Thinking Together. This year marks our third in-person collaboration with Grand Valley State University, enabled through the, you just heard, generous gift of Stuart and Barbara Padnos. This Padnos public engagement event on Jewish learning is part of a broader mission to promote Jewish and interfaith studies across the state with a focus on connecting faculty and institute fellows at the Frankel Center with audiences like yourselves in West Michigan. And I will also say a few words about the Padnos family. You've already heard a little bit about their past. Members of the Padnos family have been business people and community leaders in Michigan for over a century. In 1988, the late Stuart and Barbara Padnos established a visiting professorship in Jewish studies at the University of Michigan, named after Helen and Louis Padnos. In addition to teaching on the Ann Arbor campus, the visiting Padnos professor used to travel to Grand Rapids to provide a lecture to students, alumni, and friends. So nowadays, the three brothers, Daniel, Jeffrey, and Douglas Padnos, have carried on their parents' vision and incredible generosity through this endowed yearly lecture, which continues even though we don't have the visiting professor come to our campus. As well as they've recently gifted us with a Padnos family professorship, which is not a permanent position, endowed position in Jewish thought, which is a field that is not represented at the Frankel Center. Tonight, we are very fortunate that both Doug and Jeff are here to enjoy this event and celebrate with us. And I'm also very deeply grateful to the Padnos family for their staunch commitment to education on Jewish and interfaith topics and their support of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. So please join me in applauding their contribution to promoting the values of mutual understanding and Jewish learning, which are even more urgently needed in our day and age. This event was made possible through our partnership with GVSU, and I wish to thank the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, Doug Kinchy, and the director of operations sitting there in the back and making sure everything goes smoothly, Kyle Couyers, for their support of tonight's program. In Ann Arbor, our Frankel Center Communications and Events Coordinator, Caitlin Gordon, has been tirelessly promoting this event. And Samantha Steers, the Regional Director of Development at the University of Michigan, has provided essential support and coordination. So thank you to everyone who's been involved. And now to our esteemed speaker. So the intention behind the Padnos Professorship also guides today's annual public engagement event, which focuses on thought and practice that reveals communalities among Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Our speaker, Rebecca Wollenberg, holds a PhD in the history of religions from the University of Chicago. She came to Michigan as part of the prestigious Society of Fellows postdoctoral program and joined Judaic Studies as a full-time faculty in 2018. Professor Wollenberg researches and teaches biblical reception, spanning from the rabbis of antiquity to the early Middle Ages. So a big swath of time. Her recent book is provocatively and very interestingly titled, The Closed Book, How the Rabbis Taught the Jews Not to Read the Bible. It just came out hot off the press from Princeton University. I highly recommend that you actually open Professor Wollenberg's book and read it from cover to cover. In this study, Wollenberg destabilizes the familiar model of rabbinic Judaism as centered around a particular form of Bible study. She uncovers instead a deep ambivalence about the Bible as text and shows how rabbinic interpretation evolved through an oral and memorized approximation of the Bible. Wollenberg's research for this book was supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Academy of Religion. The Society of Biblical Literature has awarded her with the De Gruyter Prize for Biblical Reception History, the David Noel Friedman Award for Excellence in Creativity in Hebrew Bible Scholarship, and the A.R. Pete Diamond Award for Integrative Scholarship. Professor Wollenberg is currently completing a second manuscript intended for broad audiences entitled The Abrahamic Vernacular, and she will be drawing from this work today. I would also like to mention her efforts on the Ann Arbor campus and beyond to promote discussion and better understanding among students of different faiths through a project called the Abrahamic Sensorium, which is a series of interconnected sensory and experiential workshops that she has developed with Professor Yasmin Mall at U of M. And believe me, I participated in one of them, which was an olfactory experience where we sensed the smells that might have been around in antiquity and through the Middle Ages. It was fascinating. Professor Wollenberg's lecture today will provide us with a past model for thinking together across divisions and boundaries. It is my hope that it might provide some inspiration and hope for us in this very dark time in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Recently, Dean Ann Curzan of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts wrote in her communication to the Ann Arbor community, and I'm quoting her, "I hope at this moment we can continue to treat each other with utmost compassion, in line with our values, and make space to listen to each other within our community with open minds and deep respect for each other's humanity," end quote. I know that today's talk will be delivered in the spirit of openness and respect. And so now I turn things over to Professor Rebecca Wollenberg. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. You hear me all right? Is this good?
Distance, but you're good.
Okay. So as the alum in the audience will attest, I always lecture from memory. Today, I'm not going to do that. I feel like in light of the sensitive moment and the sensitive topic, I should, for once in my life, stay on script. So if you excuse me, I'm going to be very professorial and read a little to you. So what is an Abrahamic monotheism? Or to pose a more radical version of this question, is there even such a thing as an Abrahamic monotheism? In the past decade, we have arrived at a strange impasse in the study of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the universities. We live in a moment when many scholars of religion insist that the historical movements identified with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam cannot be grouped together into any sort of meaningful analytic category. At the same time, researchers are producing more comparative work than ever on the overlaps and intersections. Oh, is it moving when it's on? Excuse me.
No, it's good.
On the intersections between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim practitioners in specific historical periods. In other words, as a field, we appear to be frantically studying a phenomenon that we claim does not exist. So at this point, I would like to take a poll. Are you feeling ready? Are you warmed up enough that you're going to raise your hands for me? I do this to undergraduates all the time. So how many of you feel instinctively, based on having heard exactly 2.5 minutes of this lecture, that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have something fundamental in common, even if you can't define it? Very nice. For those online, it's 50%. And how many of you feel that these three religious movements actually have less in common than most people suppose? Okay. There's a smattering of people willing to raise their hands. And how many of you think that it's secretly both? So I think that ambivalence on this question is very natural. But I would like to propose that we are actually ambivalent because we have not yet been able to produce a satisfactory account of Abrahamic monotheisms as a category. And we have failed to come up with an adequate way to describe how these three movements are related because we've been approaching the problem backwards. For a long time, scholars approached the question of Abrahamic similarity through what one might call a Venn diagram approach to Abrahamic overlap. There was a time when scholars simply referred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the three monotheisms, as if these were the only monotheisms that human experience had ever produced. By the way, that is not true. This language certainly reproduces the revolutionary claims made by the historical practitioners of these religions, but it does not fully reflect complicated historical realities of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim conceptions of the supernatural, which have often strayed well beyond the boundaries of what we might consider restricted definitions of monotheism. More importantly, perhaps, this construction does not recognize the many forms of monotheism that other religious traditions embrace. When scholars realized that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam couldn't be differentiated from other religions by their monotheism, many researchers sought to identify other kinds of structural similarities that distinguish these three traditions as a unique formula of religious expression. Some of the possibilities they explored included the idea that Abrahamic traditions were distinguished by an acceptance of prophecy or religious universalism or the idea of sacred history. I won't bore you by walking through the whole process of how we figured out that this was not going to work, but let's just say the project hasn't gone that well. Essentially, what we discovered was that the only way to make this structural overlap model work was to create an abstracted vision of sort of pan-Abrahamic monotheism that suppressed the uniqueness of each individual tradition by creating a sort of new religion that encompassed all of them, as John Levinson put it. You look confused. This is only going to be a little of theory so that I can say what we're not going to say, and then we'll get to the stories. Okay. So this may seem counterintuitive, but I would like to invite you to take a moment to think of a concept or a practice that you consider Abrahamic. Are you actually doing it? Because that's going to be hand raising again. Okay. So now see if you can apply it to all three religions. How many traditions could you hit? Feel free to hold up some fingers. I've experienced the correct answer is always 2, right? We can hit overlaps between any 2, but no one's ever been able to find that secret spot in the middle. So as we learned this, and definitional categories just became more and more untenable, some researchers decided that we were going to uncover a history of shared origins to explain this aura of commonality within difference that continues to rest on these 3 traditions. Countless studies have sought to document the possibility of common origins between Judaism and Christianity. When did they really part ways? Does Islam have Jewish and Christian origins? Is there a conspiracy? Where did the various practices and beliefs really originated, and how were they disseminated? Who is the most true to the roots of Abrahamic monotheism? So detractors of the historical approach have argued that this interest in roots is essentially futile, because critics argue that the Abrahamic movements cannot be said to share any substantive common origins when the history that gave birth to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as distinct traditions, different from each other, has essentially been defined by supersessionism, exclusion, and persecution. So scholarly opponents of this historic school argue essentially that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as we know them, were born through difference, not commonality. And this is the point at which the discussion is currently stalled. We have reached a point where many academics are ready to just abandon the notion that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can be conceptualized as related phenomena. But what if we approach the current focus on historical conflict as an invitation rather than a closure? So recent theories have dismissed the ongoing history of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim polemic as empty of any true exchange, because the historical interlocutors were often speaking past each other. That is, Jews, Christians, and Muslims often debated a particular concept or figure with very different visions of that object in mind. So we're tempted to disregard these interactions as basically meaningless. But I would contend that the very existence of a continuing history of rivalry, supersessionism, and polemic between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam over centuries tells us otherwise. These disputes should not be imagined as a single ongoing and inevitable argument. Instead, each of these moments of polemic represents local phenomena that are continually recreated anew in different times and places. Right? This isn't like one ongoing family fight. People are died, new people are born, centuries pass, and we keep going back to this process. So the fact that religious competition repeatedly emerges between these 3 traditions again and again should draw our attention to the fact that the imaginary space between these 3 traditions has consistently been perceived as meaningful by practitioners and territory worthy of dispute. So the question we need to ask is why this disputed imaginal space between the traditions, this yellow circle, if you will, has been so vital to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim interactions. We tend to naturalize the notion that Jews, Christians, and Muslims should tussle over who holds the right to common intellectual property. But as I just noted, there isn't actually a universally shared Abrahamic legacy to dispute. Also, one can't really say that these recurrent discussions are inevitable results of a communal proximity and daily friction, because as if Jews, Christians, and Muslims were just getting on each other's nerves. In some cases, the interlocutors in these apparent dialogues actually had no immediate contact with other Abrahamic communities at all. So the turn towards this shared discursive space can even occur in the absence of any immediate challenge that needs to be addressed or redressed. Instead, that empty space between traditions appears to have some draw or function of its own. In this talk, I'd like to propose that what has drawn Jews, Christians, and Muslims back to this disputed imaginary, this central space, if you were, century after century, is the way that these discussions create a sense of collective monotheism that actually strengthens the worldview of each of the players involved. So the history of religious conflict between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam has taken place essentially against a backdrop of shared reference, biblical and Quranic characters, prophecies, mytho-historical events. In the process, that mythical backdrop itself comes to appear natural, even inevitable to all of the players involved. So that is, for instance, the very existence of shared reference in the midst of intercommunal polemic has often produced the impression that there is a neutral sacred history that stands beyond the possibility of dispute and disbelief. Right? So while contemporary scholars are quick to point out that Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers paint markedly different and even incompatible portraits of Moses, for instance, the historical practitioners themselves were more likely to conceive of this disconnect as a disagreement about a single Moses, right? So through the very process of arguing about what Moses was really like, and the rivalry over his legacy, Moses' role as a mythical historical prophet par excellence within each tradition is naturalized, right, and reinforced by the affirmation of your rival. After all, interlocutors in question are doubly primed to speak in a shared religious language by their common historical context and by normative claims made by each tradition that they are speaking about the same phenomenon. So in such interactions, Abrahamic practitioners are sort of collectively participating in an imaginary in which both insiders and outsiders alike can be said to acknowledge the veracity of certain basic premises in history. In other words, through their very use of shared terminology, Abrahamic monotheisms acquired companion traditions that have acted not only as competitors, but also as partners who obliquely strengthen the worldview of each by affirming an underlying sense of shared reality. And this pattern, in which different configurations of Jews, Christians, and Muslims have grappled with such shared reference in tandem, has left a lasting trace on each of these three traditions. If we think about it for a moment, in their centuries of rivalry over a shared imaginative space, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam naturally took on shared characteristics over the centuries because they evolved facing each other. Are you still awake? I know everyone loves theory. Okay, but here's the stories. So some of these attempts to suture different Abrahamic worldviews together were even pluralistic in a way that is recognizable to us today. That is, some Jewish, Christian, and Muslim authors sought to tell stories about how these three traditions were related to one another that actually allowed the truth claims of each to stand relatively undisturbed. So few progressive proponents of interfaith dialogue, I'm saying this at an interfaith institute, so it may not be true, but I think it is, would actually take issue, for instance, with the positions, such as those expressed by this 12th century Yemenite Jewish thinker, Hanel ibn Fayyumi, when he claimed that Muhammad was a prophet to them, that is the Muslims, but not to those who preceded them in the knowledge of God, that is the Jews, because God permitted to every people something which he forbade to others, and he forbade to them something which he permitted to others. For he knows best what his creatures need and what is adapted to them. Even a skilled physician understands his patients. So as Al-Fayyumi glosses in the words of the Quran, he sends a prophet to every people according to their language. In this rendering of Abrahamic history, both Muslims and Jews possess a true version of scripture from a single God. The obvious differences between these two prophetic testimonies reflect the particular needs of the recipients rather than any imagined imperfection in their respective access to divine truth. By imagining the God of Abraham as a physician who sends individualized guidance to his patients according to their needs, this vision of sacred history allows for pretty radical practical pluralism without undermining the notion that Jews and Muslims participate in a single spiritual reality governed by a single divine being. Instead, it combines Jewish and Muslim accounts of prophetic history into a single extended account that allows the basic truth claims of each to remain intact by limiting the scope of their application. All right, Thumbs up or thumbs down? Are you buying this? Would you take this guy's class? Okay, so far so good. Ibn al-Arabi, everyone loves him. So one also encounters the claim that revelation refracted differently for different Abrahamic communities in the book of Muslim authors such as the 13th century Andalusian mystic Ibn al-Arabi, who argued in his Meccan revelations that each of the Abrahamic prophets and sages had been sent a version of revelation uniquely appropriate to his time or place. So as he says here, the article makes the word religion definite, which is to say there is only the religion, because all religions come from God, even if some of the rulings are diverse. Everyone is commanded to perform the religion and come together in it, that is, in the ways on which we all agree. As for the rulings which are different, that is because the law which God assigned each one of his messengers, he said to every one of the prophets, we've appointed a law and a way, and if God will, he would have made you one nation. If you'd done that, your revealed laws would not be different and diverse. So like Al-Fayyumi, Ibn Arabi understood the diversity of revealed religion, both within Islam actually, and among other Abrahamic traditions, to reflect the needs of different communities at different moments. For Ibn Arabi, therefore, the revelations of Judaism and Christianity had neither been corrupted nor abrogated in the sense that they were subsequently abolished or repealed. Rather, their own continuing but provincial manifestation of divine truth had simply been eclipsed by the brighter light of the Quran. As Ibn Arabi opines elsewhere in his Meccan revelations, all the revealed religions are light. Among these religions, the revealed religion of Muhammad is like the light of the sun among the light of the stars. When the sun appears, the lights of the stars are hidden. Their being hidden is like abrogation of other revealed religions that takes place through Muhammad's revealed religion, but they do in fact exist, which is to say they're true, just as the existence of the light of the stars is actualized. This explains why we have been required in all our inclusive religion to have faith in the truth of all the messengers of all the revealed religions. They are not rendered null by abrogation. That is only the opinion of the ignorant. Well, Ibn Arabi certainly perceives a hierarchy of Abrahamic religions. I saw some faces, people are like, I mean, if you're the sun, I don't know. But the Quran definitely represents a brighter and more universal manifestation of God's truth in this account. But he does simultaneously validate the truth of diverse Abrahamic teachings and the unique ability of each to shed light on a particular facet of the divine. Others, this is a little less pluralistic, but I happen to love the author. Others are willing to acknowledge the truth value of other Abrahamic traditions without necessarily affirming their revelation per se. So in his 8th century Syriac work, Apology of Timothy the Patriarch before the Caliph Mahdi, for instance, the Nestorian patriarch Timothy I offers the following account of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was worthy of all praise by all reasonable people. He walked in the path of the prophets and trod in the tracks of the lover of God. All the prophets taught the doctrine of one God, and since Muhammad taught the doctrine of the unity of God, he walked therefore in the path of the prophets. Further, all the prophets drove men away from bad works and brought them nearer to good works. And since Muhammad drove his people away from bad works and brought them nearer to good ones, he walked therefore in the path of the prophets. Again, all the prophets separated men from idolatry and polytheism and attached them to God and his cult. And since Muhammad separated his people from idolatry and polytheism and attached them to the cult and the knowledge of one God, besides whom there is no other God, it is obvious that he walked in the path of the prophets. Finally, Muhammad taught about God, his word, his spirit, which is to say Jesus and the Holy Spirit as well. And Muhammad walked therefore in the path of the prophet. And then he goes on to say, did Moses slay all the idol worshippers with his sword? And then he's praising the early conquest of Islam and says, that is righteous. That's righteous prophetic zeal right there. Abraham smashing the idols, Muhammad smashed idols. He's a real Abraham, that one. So while the Christian patriarch did not acknowledge the Quran as a new divine revelation, he was still willing to grant that Muhammad also founded a biblical religion of sorts. That is, Timothy quoted Muhammad as the second biblical Abraham, turning his people from idolatry to monotheism. In the early Islamic conquest, Timothy glimpsed the spirit of Moses as he ordered the idolatrous worshippers of the golden calf to their death. Taken as a whole, Timothy argued that the precepts of Islam removed the practitioners from bad deeds and brought them closer to correct conduct. Most importantly, perhaps, the patriarch maintained that the teachings of Islam brought its adherents to knowledge of the one God, and even taught its adherents about Jesus and the Holy Spirit. In other words, Timothy maintained that Islam captured the spirit of biblical prophecy without a prophet of its own, because Muhammad trod in the tracks of the lovers of God. So even these more pluralistic views of how the three Abrahamic traditions relate are hardly egalitarian, I admit that. Each author makes their own hierarchy of truth claims. But I think we need to acknowledge how each of these tussles over the Abrahamic legacy not only defined particular communal boundaries, but also simultaneously contributed to a broader affirmation that the God of Abraham ruled over all communities, or at least all communities that mattered. When historical practitioners, to be clear, to the historical actors, all communities matter, because we're talking this live stream, okay. Through this collective form of collective monotheism, such thinkers displace the possibility of an existence beyond the boundaries of communal belief between religious communities. And the boundary between religious communities was not between believer and naysayer at this point, but instead marked a different perception of the same irrefutable sacred phenomenon. So far, we've looked at imaginaries that knit Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together from afar, as it were. However, many Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars over the centuries have also studied their respective traditions together. Sometimes interreligious discussion was formalized. The medieval institute of the Majlis, an intramural theological or philosophical salon, sort of like French Revolution style, that took place in Islamic hate societies, represented a forum in which wider communal dialogue or debate took place regularly. In some cases, a community majlis might be quite pluralistic. As one Muslim traveler to 10th century Baghdad supposedly complained, we have this report in somebody else's diary making fun of this guy, but I think it's a true complaint. He says, at the first session I attended, I saw a majlis which included every kind of group, Sunni Muslims and heretics, thinking it's Shiite, and all kinds of infidels and materialists and atheists and Christians and Jews, and each group had a leader who would speak on its doctrine and debate. Whenever a leader arrived, from whichever group he was, the assembly rose up for him in respect, standing on their feet until he sat down. When the majlis was jammed with its participants and they saw no one else was expected, one of the infidels said, this guy's really mad, you should all agree to debate, so Muslims should not argue against us on the basis of sayings of their prophet, since we place no credence in it and do not acknowledge him. Let us dispute with one another only on the common basis of arguments from reason and what observations and deductions will support. Then they would say, agreed. Abu Umar said, when I heard that, I did not return to that majlis. Later, someone told me there was going to be another majlis for discussion down the street, essentially. So I went to it and found them also involved in the same practice as their colleagues. So I stopped going to majlis of the theologians and never went back. He gave up. These people were far too accepting for him. So according to Abu Umar, 10th century Baghdad hosted multiple theological majlis in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims were relatively equal participants. The leaders of each community were honored for the practice of rising before a scholar. A non-Muslim could open the debate. More importantly, in a society with an official dominant religion, all participants had agreed to argue from the grounds of reason rather than religious authority, which, as you can imagine, would have gotten awkward. So in the relatively humanistic and pluralistic scholarly culture of medieval Baghdad, such ecumenical majlis may well have taken place regularly. Not all of these joint study sessions were so formal or polemical, though. Sometimes interpreters simply worked together with experts from other Abrahamic communities to refine their own understandings of vital texts written in ancient languages that were no longer perfectly understood. In the preface to one translation of the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, produced for Coptic Christians in 1242 CE, the author, it's funny, we know the exact year this was written in, but we don't know who the author was. That always confuses me, but there it is. So this anonymous author in 1242 explains how and why he created a base text by sitting together with a Jewish colleague to produce a correct edition and interpretation of the 10th century Rabbi Sa'adi Gaon's annotated Judeo-Arabic translation of the Hebrew Bible. Here's how he describes it. While studying the Holy Torah, I found Arabic versions that I had become acquainted with differing from one another in some of the expressions. As a consequence, they deviated in their meaning. What am I supposed to do? I only read Arabic, the translations don't agree. What next? So I scrutinized this matter with care and found it to be due to the translators from one language into another during different ages. Okay. However, as I perused the translations of the learned rabbinate Sayyid al-Fayyumi, Fayyum produced really cool scholars. This is the second one tonight. I satisfied myself that owing to his style, that he is the most preferred of all the translators and the most elegant interpreter among all the peoples of his confession. Best Jewish Bible translator ever. So thus, I copied his version in what follows in this preface with the intention of editing it more accurately. For this purpose, I summoned to my aid one of the most notable Israelites, whose name is stated at the end of this copy. That's now been lost, but I'm sure it was great. He had memorized the text and recalled its words skillfully. Further, he was well versed in the study of its expressions, recitation, and everything related to the interpretation of its meaning. So in his hand, he held a copy in Hebrew letters from which he read aloud in Arabic. And in my hand, I held the present copy in Arabic letters, which is Sa'adi's translation that I intended to transcribe. What is more, I had at my disposal a number of commentaries of Christian, Jewish, and Samaritan provenance. Okay. Does this make sense? So basically, they have an Arabic translation of the Torah, and on one side of the table is a Christian reading Arabic and Arabic, but on the other side of the table is a Jew reading Arabic and Hebrew script, and between them is a table spread out with Christian, Jewish, and Samaritan commentaries, and they're trying to produce a common edition. Very nice, I think. I'm a professor, so I think this nerdy little picture is like, oh, it's so touching. Okay. In this passage, we encounter an example of scholarly collaboration that approaches religious pluralism as I think we understand that term. In Muslim Egypt, two Arabic-speaking Abrahamic minorities worked together without any apparent power dynamics to produce the best possible translation of a shared book, drawing on their own scholarly expertise and religious commentaries produced by a variety of Abrahamic communities, Christian, Jewish, Samaritan. There's no romanticism in this account and no search for lost knowledge or anything like that. The author of this preface was simply dissatisfied with the renderings of the Bible available to him and thought out the best possible translation tradition, even though that translation was produced by an expert from a different Abrahamic community. If the Jews have the best translation, you go to them. The author is willing to turn to a Jewish expert to help him with his work because he believes that he and his compatriot are fundamentally in agreement on some level concerning the nature and meaning of the Holy Torah. Here, the notion of a shared scriptural vernacular is literalized. They're both speaking scriptural Arabic, which is funny because it's not actually a scriptural language, but for them it was. Or it's a Quranic one, it's not a biblical language. So the two scholars from different communities sit together to read a biblical translation in a shared oral vernacular by using texts written in different scripts. So they're reading the same book, but in two distinct communally inflected editions. And I feel like that's a really nice metaphor for what we're talking about here. Nor were these kinds of interreligious encounters limited to scholarly circles. If anything, we have far more descriptions of these sorts of overlap among lay practitioners. So in accounts of shrines, for example, and other sort of semi-official religious spaces shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, one witnesses a variety of ways in which practitioners from multiple communities could construct disparate but interlocking scriptural accounts of a single powerful site. So in some cases, visitors from different Abrahamic communities did actually appear, miraculously, to agree on the history and purpose of the site. So in one 14th century travelogue from Jewish Cairo, for instance, Iqadal the scribe describes Muslims and Jews praying to the same God in roughly the same manner at the tomb of Aaron, Moses' brother, in Petra, in Jordan. And he says, many come to bow down and prostrate themselves. The Gentiles, i.e. the Muslims, maintain the place in great purity and for the honor of the prophet Aaron, peace be upon him. They pay respect to the Jews and honor them, and allow them to enter and prostrate themselves and pray there. So they're also doing full prostration like the Muslims. Everyone's praying exactly the same way in the same tomb. And then he goes on and says, may the Lord answer their and our prayers and the prayers of his entire nation of Israel, to say the Jewish people. Amen. There's the tomb. That's not what it looked like at the time, but it's very beautiful. According to Ibn Gadal, both Muslims who maintain the tomb, pictured here, and the Jews who visited it, honored the same scriptural figure of Aaron and prostrated themselves to the one God at his tomb in the same way. So while practitioners might have come to the shrine inspired by slightly different accounts of this scriptural Aaron, each drawn from his own tradition, Ibn Gadal appears to harbor no doubt that both communities honor a single scriptural figure and pray to the same God. On the contrary, he expects God to answer both equally. Both their prayers and ours should be answered here. Now it gets a little weirder. This is interesting. So to say that such practitioners shared a scriptural vernacular, like a common sort of everyday scriptural imaginary, did not mean that all participants believed identically about the scriptural traditions in question. So in some cases, multiple communities might come together to worship at a single site for approximately the same reason, but they often offered slightly different accounts of the scriptural narrative in question. So as this 5th century church historian Sozomen, for instance, described the interdenominational gatherings held at Mamre, where Abraham was said to have been visited by 3 angels after his circumcision. You don't remember the story? Are you even listening to me? I know you're fucking great. I'm sorry. I know you're all adults. I'm very used to teaching college students, and I tease them, so please forgive me. Some of our community members are looking a little. You can always come back to the University of Michigan anytime and enjoy this. So, to say such practitioners, here he says, here's the describe it. Here are the inhabitants of the country and the regions around Palestine. I'm going to make a pause here because of the situation and say that I personally call Byzantine Palestine, Palestine, contemporary Israel, Israel. Like whoever's in charge gets to name the country for their century. Okay, so it doesn't mean anything. I'm just telling you that, right? Okay. So here are the inhabitants of the country and the regions around Palestine assemble annually during the summer season to keep a feast. Indeed, this feast is diligently frequented by all nations, by the Jews because they boast of their descent from the patriarch Abraham, by the Greeks because angels appeared there to men, and by Christians because he for whom salvation of mankind was born of a virgin manifests himself there to a godly man. Okay, I'm going to pause there. This is a very old Christian tradition that many have forgotten. So as these particular Christians are thinking, imagining it, Jesus himself appears among the angels as like a foreshadowing before Abraham, right? So the Christians are thinking Jesus did arrive, which some people still remember, but many don't. The Jews are like, hey, Abraham's really boss, right? And the Greeks are like, oh, it's cool, angels, let's go. Okay. And they all do religious exercises there. Some pray to God, some call on the angels, some pour out wine or burn incense, some offer an ox, old school Hebrew Bible, Old Testament style. So, in Leda Tig Mamre, okay, this is actually not the same tree, but we claim it is, so enjoy. This is the tree it all happened by. Clearly the tree is not, in fact, 1,500 years old, but imagine. So in Leda Tig Mamre, pictured here in a modern photograph, Sozomen reports that many nations worshipped in parallel to honor the appearance of angels to the patriarch Abraham. Yet each community emphasized a different aspect of that biblical tale. Jews called upon the ancestral merits of their patriarch Abraham. Christians emphasized an early Christian tradition that Christ appeared to Abraham at Mamre along with 2 angels. As Sozomen puts it, the Christians celebrated the fact that the Son of God appeared to Abraham with 2 angels who had been sent against Sodom and foretold the birth of his son. While local Greeks simply came to honor the appearance of angels to human beings because that's super neat. So Jewish and Christian versions of the Mamre story remain subtly incompatible in this account, right? As Jews were pretty unlikely to conceive that Christ had ever appeared among the angels that visited Abraham. And yet, Sozomen also claims that all the visitors honored the site fittingly with their religious exercises. So just as in Ibn Gadal's accounts of the tomb of Abraham in Petra, Both Jews and Christians at Norway are acknowledged here to worship a single shared deity, the God of all, each in their own way, perhaps with slight misunderstandings, each imagining the other as the one slightly in the wrong, to do what you can do. Right? So shared sites and practices also entangle the post-scriptural religious lives of Abrahamic practitioners in another way. It was not uncommon for observers from Abrahamic communities to interpret the ritual activities of other Abrahamic communities in scriptural terms, watching their fellows kind of like a play. So this was true even when the practices in question were undoubtedly new innovations, right? The power of the human imagination to attribute, ancient mystical meaning to something is pretty unparalleled. So, for example, in the 11th century, this Persian traveler, Nasir Khusrau, reports regarding the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Now the men of Syria and the neighboring parts call the holy city by the name Al-Quds. And the people of these provinces, if they are unable to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, will instead go up during the appointed season of Hajj to the Dome of the Rock complex in Jerusalem, and there perform their rites, such as processing in a circle around the Kaaba, as customary to do at Mecca on the same day. Okay, we just make sure that, I don't know how many of you have been inside the Dome of the Rock, but there's a giant rock, which is why it's called that. So according to Khusrau, local Muslims adapted the rituals of the Meccan Hajj to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, approaching the ancient stone at the center of the site with rituals developed for the Kaaba in Mecca. Does that make sense? Okay, so they're up there, they're processing around the Dome of the Rock and doing their own sort of like mini local Hajj, of which this Persian traveler is kind of, he's a little eye-rolly about it, honestly. They made up this new practice, you're supposed to go to Mecca, why are they doing this? But you know who's enthusiastic? The Jews standing on Mount of Olives. So in the old days, the Jews didn't usually go up the Temple Mount, there's purity issues, it's very complicated. Instead, they would go to the Mount of Olives at this particular site where you can look onto the Dome of the Rock and they would watch the Muslims. That was their entertainment. I mean, not in a bad way, but just that's what they wanted to do. You'd go up there, you'd see what was going on the Dome of the Rock. And what was going on was Muslim worship. Now, here's how one 13th century Jewish observer, Rabbi Jacob, imagined the local Muslims honoring the site of the lost Jewish temple with the rites of the ancient Israelites. Okay, so here's what he thinks he sees. Round the Eben Hashtiah, the foundation stone, that rock I just showed you, the Ishmaelite kings have built a very beautiful house for a prayer erected on the top of very fine cupola. The building is on the site of the Holy of Holies of the sanctuary, and the Muslims gather there in their holy days in crowds and dance around it in procession as the Israelites used to do on the 7th day of the festival of Sukkot. Oh, it's so nice. It's in Chabad So you understand what's happening. The Muslims are doing this thing because essentially they just can't stand to go on Hajj right now. Like, for whatever reason, they want to be local, they want to go home to their mother-in-law who's sick, whatever it is. So they're doing processing on the Dome of the Rocks. And the Jews are watching from Mount of Olives, and what they see is their lovely Ishmaelite brothers keeping the holy, temple rituals alive for them. And it's really sweet. It wasn't true, but it's lovely. So when he witnessed the medieval pilgrimage rites developed by his Muslim compatriots, Rabbi Jacob saw an echo of the ancient practice of circling the temple altar at Hakafot for the 7th day of Sukkot, attributed to the biblical time. In this report, rabbinic tales of how things were in biblical times have become entangled with medieval Muslim practices to create a novel sort of biblical tableau. This is like the nativity play, right, of the medieval times for them, in which one can witness the historical descendants of the biblical Ishmael honoring the lost Temple of Solomon with ancient Israelite rites. It's a really neat idea. And we have so many of these examples. So, the study of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim relations is often framed as an affective history, that is, a history of emotion. That is, contemporary scholarship frequently characterizes historical relations between Abrahamic communities in emotional terms and evaluates intercommunal interaction based on the affection or antipathy expressed by religious authorities toward one another. Right? Were the Jewish authorities saying complimentary things about the Muslims? Did the Muslims like the Jews? That's what they want to know. These are very important questions. How a society treats religious minorities often has dramatic and lasting historical implications, as we know very well. But what I wanted to emphasize this evening is that the attitudes of religious practitioners towards one another don't actually determine whether or to what extent two religious communities become entangled with one another, intellectually, historically, culturally. In the sampling of historical examples we explored this evening, even Abrahamic communities that were ostensibly at odds with one another often developed shared scriptural vernaculars that changed the religious imaginary of all the players involved. And over the course of centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims from across the globe have repeatedly done this, writing other Abrahamic communities into their own sacred histories, praying together, studying together, co-authoring a rich library of new scriptural vernaculars. And in this moment, that's what I want us to sit with. Thank you.
So thank you so much for allowing us to really examine these sort of less well-known and possibly, more intriguing and hopefully thought-provoking for you all examples from both mainly from the medieval time, but of different types of thinking together across religious boundaries and working together, practicing, translating together, praying together. So now we have time for questions and answers, both from the audience here, but if there's anything in the Q&A afterwards from the Zoom, you're nodding, we will get to that. So we have a microphone here, and Kyle's, thank you for passing it around, and we'll let you field questions.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with the current practice called scriptural reasoning.
Yes.
Which I learned when I was at Cambridge University, which we practice some of that here in the Kaufman Institute, where the Jewish text is read in Hebrew and then translated, the Christian text read in Greek and then translated, and of course the Quranic text they're recited in Arabic and then translated. It's a very exciting way of the shared vernaculars.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But there were polls. You have no questions?
I don't know your question, but I was intrigued by your example of people from different communities. I don't know, it was from medieval time, trying to come to the best possible translation. I just wondered what criteria they used. How did they know when they had? Did they look for consistency, the power of the story that was told? So you have people from diverse communities. They must have some common goal, some understanding to arbitrate.
So it's so strange because they seem to work by consensus and common sense. So we have other examples, for example, from Muslim Spain and actually from Christian Spain. They were getting people to come from over the border of Muslim Spain and come learn together. And they just sat together, and if they had enough texts, I guess they argued until they agreed which interpretation was correct. And then it went into the official translation. And then that was disseminated incredibly widely. So there weren't even rules. They were just scholars who sat together, and the translations for hundreds and even thousands of people were determined by two men, usually from different communities, who had a relationship with one another and somehow came to an agreement this was true. And that was what everyone else was taught. And it's such an interesting idea. Now I'm going to go off script for a second. My mother always said, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy, Rebecca? And this is a funny example of people who essentially wanted to be happy, and that's how you decided what was right. If we can agree this is true, then it is the most true. That makes sense.
They're also sharing the notion of a sacred text.
Yes, absolutely.
Think about sacred text, which was uniting.
And the truth is, a lot of these people actually believed on some level in ongoing revelation, and many of them thought that they themselves were pretty inspired. So You know, Moses Maimonides used to say, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses, right? So it's possible that these really elite scholars actually thought they were inspired when they were doing this translating work together. Absolutely.
Can you talk about the role of reason and rationality and the importance of sort of certain ways of arguing rather than evoking authority, as you explained in one of those great quotes? So can you talk more about the role of reason in this kind of building together of a shared understanding of religion?
So that's a really good example. So this Majlis culture, which is a salon culture that went on for centuries in different, countries all over the Middle East, the basic understanding was that you can't argue for authority because that doesn't convince the other party. They don't believe in your scripture, they don't believe in your rabbi, whatever it is. You have to argue from reason and convince them based on your human commonality. But the part about that I find really interesting is that that's where the shared truth lies, right? That idea that there's no unbelief, right? There's just belief and we can disagree about how it works. It's so interesting. The idea that if you go back to reason, you will eventually discover a fundamental shared truth we can all agree on. It's fascinating, especially for university professors. You're like, hey, you know where the reason people are? Come to class, right? So it's in some ways like a very very modern view of how religion works. Religion isn't irrational in this system. Religion is so rational it can stand a little bit of skepticism, pushing and poking. What God's shoulders are broad, he can handle it,
Yet that doesn't seem to work today with people who are so rigid in their interpretation. And we see how the Bible is interpreted in so many different ways, even within the Christian community. Where's reason gone?
I'll tell you. So we have a colleague called Brian O'Malley, who I've actually never met, but I really liked his book. And he did a study, an ethnographic study, of a particular evangelical community in Ann Arbor and some other places, like in Michigan. An ethnographic study. He would just come to Wednesday night Bible study and participate. And he himself, I think, was religious, but I don't remember if I had. And he has this really, now I feel really embarrassed because we're like live streaming on the off chance he's listening to this. I'm like, here's what I think your book is about. But he had this really interesting point, which is that actually all the times he's watching, this community, which within the United States is generally considered one of the most Bible reading communities in the States, almost never actually opened the book. Instead, many people were doing what he called using the transitive property. So like, it's really common. And actually, now that he said it, I notice it everywhere. Jewish communities, Christian, whatever. People put their hand on the Bible and they're like, in this book, it says, and then they just say whatever they want to say, right? It's like so interesting. I guess you touched Paul, so then Paul said, right? And I feel like that's where a lot of us are getting off the train and having arguments. I mean, the thing that's really, I want to emphasize about the stories I'm telling is that they were, except in the Majlis, where they were just trying to argue about, philosophical concepts. All the people I'm meeting for this book project are literally reading together. There's always manuscripts open on the table. They're doing this sort of scriptural reasoning practice. And that seems to have helped a lot. So maybe a little less of a Paul said what I want him to say thing would help a little bit with that interaction.
That was actually one of my questions. The other question I have is, so you're talking a lot about how scholars work together to understand things. Where were the people in this? Were people as open and as welcoming of other thought, the thought of other, or was it just more in the scholarly realm?
So much more so. So I didn't bring these examples because they usually involve a lot of book practice and it's harder to explain. But these scholars who are themselves working together with other scholars and reading together and everything, they spend half their time complaining about how the lay practitioners are taking it way too far. So like John Chrysostom, for example, claims his entire community is always running after Jewish healing. And he's really sarcastic. He's like, what, every time you get a cold, you're gonna abandon Jesus and go to the Jews? What is happening? I mean, it's really, these sermons are pretty funny actually, right? We have the other way. So we have these really interesting stories, which scholars discount, other scholars, I'm also a scholar, I think they're true, which is, for example, Jewish women attending or going to the milk cave, the milk grotto, where a drop of Mary's milk is supposed to have fallen, and Christian women and many Muslim women later believe that if you went there, like if you couldn't nurse your baby, which in the ancient world was a huge disaster because the baby could die if you couldn't find a wet nurse, they would go to this cave and the strength of Mary's milk would reinvigorate you and you'd save your baby. Amazing. But the interesting thing is, we think that Jewish women also went to Mary's milk grotto, right? How were they conceptualizing that Mary? It's not clear. The Jewish stories we have about Mary are very interesting. They portray her as a victim of men and even the rabbinic system. And the men mean this as kind of a little bit of a denigration. Like, look, Mary, the mother of God, was just like a mistreated woman who was confused. I think for Jewish women hearing that story, they're like, oh, I'm on Mary's side here. I'm going to the milk grotto, right? And we have so many stories like that where lay practitioners like heard things from their teachers and were like, you know what I'm going to do? Thank you for sharing that teaching. I'm going to get off the train and go to like the Muslim site. So we have Jewish women, for example, often snuck into the shrine of the patriarchs in Hebron, like in Muslim stuff, right? And like just all of these interactions like that. Women in particular, who are apparently not amazing at listening, I think that's what happens when you don't teach people how to read. They're like, well, this is what I want then. So yeah, there was a lot of lay practitioners doing this stuff.
We have a question from our Zoom audience. A little long, bear with me. How can the luxury of rivals thinking together stand up to the territorial imperative? The Golden Age of Spain was followed by the Inquisition and expelling 2 of the 3 religions. This, of course, was followed by Moorish conquest. Today, the discussion, if you want to call it that, at least, is about territory. How can rivals think together in the context of endless territorial conflict?
So that's one of the interesting things about these stories. The way we tell this story to kids, I mean, I at least tell my kids these stories, right? Is like this golden age of everyone just getting along. That's a little kid version of the story. And I tried to press on that side of things a little tonight because we're living through dark times and why not bring a little joy to the world? But the way this actually went down is these discussions happen in the midst of those territorial conflicts. So for example, they're trying to produce a Latin version of the Quran in the midst of the Reconquista. And like, there's a war going on. And there's a really funny story in the preface to that. There's actually first a Castilian version of this book, and then he's going to translate it to Latin. He doesn't actually do it. But anyway, there's a Christian working on a translation of the Quran. And in the preface, he basically found this Muslim scholar he really liked, who was living on the other side of the border. He's like, hey, come to my house and we'll work on a translation of the Quran. You will be shocked to hear that guy was like, no, right? Like, that sounds dangerous and not a good idea. So this man said, okay, fine, I will go to the bishop and I will guarantee your safety. And also, I'll give you a ton of money if you agree to be escorted here and cross the border and work on this thing. The guy was like, well, I mean, if you give me a ton of money, okay. And he comes and they produce this like Castilian version of the Quran, which now anyone can use. And actually, the Muslim scholar liked what they'd done so much that he took a copy of it back himself. So now 2 communities on 2 sides of a disputed border in the middle of a pretty ugly war are both reading a jointly produced ecumenical Quran. Pretty cool. So the answer is, I think, that it is really important to keep up these dialogues, even in the midst of the worst ugliness. And hopefully those are the things that will survive the centuries, right? This translation survived. That war didn't, right? We end on that, you know? Yeah.
Ask a naive question. I guess when these scholars meet and encounter different versions of the same story, such as Abraham sacrificing Isaac, I think the Quran tells it entirely different. Will they come to a stop at that point? Because what do they say to each other? I mean, right? There's this total difference right at the beginning.
So a thing I found really interesting is I noticed this recently, just working with the students' work. A lot of times what happens is both players are sure that their character is right. Clearly it's Isaac, clearly it's Ishmael, whatever the difference is. You're sure of that. But the Midrash, the Jewish legendary tradition, or the Hadith, the Muslim oral tradition, will then be the same with different characters. So they seem to see that as a fundamental misunderstanding of the other side of a basic truth. So it's very interesting to me that you could say like, well, you've totally misunderstood who almost got sacrificed, but your story about how it happened sounds really authentic and deep to me. So I'm going to take the story and substitute the players. Like for us, that makes absolutely no sense. Once someone's telling a story about the wrong person, I'm getting off the train. I'm like, that happened to my sister Lucy, not your friend Rebecca. Like, what is even happening here? We view that with mistrust, but they often had a very deep commitment to the idea that the other person knew something they wanted. And that if they just misunderstood it a little bit, that didn't invalidate the testimony. So we have a really funny version. So Timothy of Baghdad, remember, he came up earlier. He was one who said Muhammad was a biblical teacher, but not a biblical prophet. So he has, I really think it's a funny lecture, a funny letter. He writes this letter to a friend of his out, number 8, in Byzantine Palestine. And he writes him a letter and he says, I've heard that the Jews just found these documents in a cave in the desert. By the way, they probably did. It was probably like Dead Sea Scrolls we lost. And I've heard they were the best biblical manuscripts ever. I want them so much, my loins are burning. I love that word. I'm just really hot for these letters. Can you get me a copy? None of the Jews here will get me a copy. And he goes this whole thing, he can't get a copy. But he doesn't think that the Jews are trustworthy about Christ or about certain things about God. Like he thinks they're fundamentally wrong with so many things. But he wants to trust them on theological issues, on those kinds of things, right? And so he's trying to get his friends to run all over the world to get this copy of these things the Jews found, and they have the Jews interpret it for him. It's hard for us to understand. They're a pretty modern way of sort of a mushy way of thinking, but they all seem to have it. I mean, over and over, all of these examples. Oh, well, you're kind of wrong, but you know the secret tradition, or you can teach me that. That makes sense. I'm not sure that was the best example. I just love my loins are burning for your manuscript. As a scholar, it's like, oh, we've all been there. Like, how did that archiving fans get those, and why are they under lock and key, right? So, does that make sense a little bit? It doesn't make sense to me either. It's just how they thought. Does that make sense?
It makes, yeah, but I'm struggling because, I mean, certainly, some person is going to say, well, Muhammad said it that way, or he got that, feel that. So I don't understand how the discussion proceeds beyond that point.
I think so. We did a lot of studies back when I was, in graduate school. We had this little moment of sociological religion, and people just thought. So you know how like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, or Church of Latter-day Saints, will send like fairly young folks knock on your door to persuade you of something. And I actually had a Bible scholar friend who told a really funny story. Because Church of Latter-day Saints sends 19-year-old missionaries to your door, and they're supposed to persuade you of the truth of the Book of Mormon. And he was a Bible scholar, and he said, actually, I never read the Book of Mormon. Can you give me a copy and come back in a month? Poor kids, they had no idea who we were dealing with. They show up a month later, he's got the entire thing all marked up, and he's like, so I have some questions. This is going to be a contradiction, and I didn't realize you believed in the Trinity. And he's asking all these questions, these poor missionaries about to cry. And what I realized was what they realized as sociological people was that all of those systems are set up based on affective ties. It's about making people like you, setting up relationships, and after you've done that, you can tell them almost anything. They were testing it out. They were like, okay, well, Jehovah's Witnesses, this is a pretty mainstream religion. Church of Latter-day Saints, same. They started testing that on what we would call cults, what we now call new religious movements, to be pluralistic. If you're nice to people, you can say like, the savior is coming from the sun right now, and we're all going to leave in a spaceship, and people will say, oh, okay, because you're nice to them. There's some sort of suspension of disbelief involved in that relational connection, which is really, really powerful. And so Right, but also like, it's also how regular religions work, right? So that's how intercommunal relations are made to go, even when we fundamentally disagree. And it feels really illogical, but we have evidence over and over and over again around the world that this is how you convert people, how you persuade people, how you make friends. It's like, you serve them coffee by the hour and offer them some scones, and then later you tell them about the spaceship, and right? Only then. That's how it works. And then the checkbook, ideally, right? Exactly.
Okay, and so I just want to say again, a big thank you to Professor Rebecca Wollenberg for this fascinating time. And for teaching us, yeah, you also got to teach us. And again, thank you to the Kaufman Institute, Interfaith Institute, for hosting us here. I really hope you all stay for some treats and to meet what? Scones and, yes, scones and conversation in which we don't have to agree, but we can be nice and kind to each other. And thank you everyone who is streaming this live. Thank you for attending remotely and have a good evening.